Is Dr. Fauci the most dangerous bureaucrat ever? Is the lack of middle managers a good reason to support communism? Is social justice compatible with the Christian ethic? We answer these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This, of course, is the show where we go through our social media feeds. We find all kinds of interesting takes. We break down whether we like them or don't like them and what makes them interesting. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host, Britt. And before we get started, just a reminder to give us a like, a subscribe, a follow, all that good stuff if you can afford to give it. And follow us on our channels at Good Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Take Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on YouTube and Twitter. Without further ado, we'll get into the takes. So this first take comes from Newsmax reporting a quote from Ted Cruz, a senator from Texas, who tweets, or who says, "Dr. Fauci is the most dangerous bureaucrat to ever serve in the United States government." What do you think about this take, Britt?
So we're critiquing Ted Cruz saying this, not Newsmax tweeting it out.
Yeah. Newsmax can report it. That's fine. This is just the Ted Cruz quote.
I don't really like it. I mean, I would rate Fauci maybe the top 20 most dangerous bureaucrats we've had in the United States government. I mean, he's not a bureaucrat anymore, so he's not the most that's in there. Maybe top 20, but there's a lot of other bureaucrats. I mean, a lot of the generals, a lot of the heads of all the alphabet agencies and stuff. Ones that we don't really know about, but influence our ability to go kill millions of people in other countries, as well as, inflate our currency and stuff. So to me, this is a bad take in that Ted Cruz is clearly saying this because he can throw a little bit of red meat to his base. It's kind of a bummer he didn't say this, in March of 2020 when Donald Trump was president and putting Fauci out there because, that would have actually been a little bit brave to say it then. But now that he's saying it now, when everyone, that's his base, is going to support it, just seems kind of wishy-washy, which is kind of in line with how Ted Cruz tends to operate.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like Ted Cruz is one of those people who he's almost close to being good, which just means that he'll disappoint you more often than anyone else will. I agree. I think Fauci is certainly up there, but it's always, I mean, the temptation in any political scene is to say X is the most Y. So this is the most important election of our lifetime, or Barack Obama is the worst president in American history. And it just lacks historic context. When it comes to dangerous bureaucrats, the US has had no shortage of them. And like you said, I agree, Dr. Fauci is probably up there for sure because he's done horrible things. But we also have to recognize that Dr. Fauci wasn't single-handedly the one who shut down the country. Remember, he advocated for it. He lied before Congress under oath in many ways, but he, in his role, didn't have as much authority to enact these things. I think that shows the power of the other bureaucratic machinery in the government, where there were other rules being made by like OSHA based on his stuff, and then of course governors themselves decided to comply all under this. I think when you look at the actual power he wielded, so much of it was only possible through other mechanisms like corporate media collusion, versus someone who I would argue is probably in contention. Although I'm sure there's someone who I don't even know about. They're just so nefarious and behind the scenes. But I would say like J. Edgar Hoover, potentially for the most dangerous bureaucrat to ever serve in the U.S. government. But I mean, you could even go back to all the way to like some of the earliest Supreme Court judges, John Marshall, I think. It's not conventionally dangerous in the same way that like a military general might be, but he paved the way for a government that took control and allowed the powers to exist. So in that sense, he was one of the most dangerous bureaucrats ever. And yes, a Supreme Court justice can be a bureaucrat. They're appointed by the government and they make rulings sort of unswayed by popular opinion, which can be a good thing, but also can be a bad thing.
I also think why Fauci doesn't make the, like pretty high on the list of the most dangerous bureaucrats ever is that he was so egotistical that he had to be out in front of the cameras all the time, which in turn also made people not like him, right? Like, I mean, even if it's only 40% of the population is like, we really don't like that guy. I mean, that's a significant portion, right? 40% of 350 million people or whatever, give or take 120 million people. So that's a lot of folks. Whereas with you have someone like J. Edgar Hoover, or you have Colonel Edward House, with Woodrow Wilson, these people that are a little bit more shadow behind the scenes, Donald Rumsfeld, people that like kind of push these presidents and push these people that are the spokespeople for these policies, but you don't really know who they are, and so therefore you can't really, most Americans don't know who they are, so they don't, there's not a lot of resistance to their policies, or to even know how they're maneuvering. Those people are much more dangerous. And the only way for us to like make sure those people always exist, people that want to use that type of strategy, they use anonymity, lack of public awareness to take control and to implement things that are not good. The only way to really eliminate that is to make people aware of them, or to shrink the government so small that there's nowhere for them to hide within it. Ideally, zero at all, where people make their own decisions and all that. But yeah, Dr. Fauci is obviously, I really don't like him. You and I are not big fans at all, but he's somewhat of a scapegoat in some of the ways for the entire COVID regime that came about. Definitely like a worthy one, I would say, and definitely I think portrays the arrogance and the desire to control the population, and the amount of how much he despised just the general American public not listening to him. He definitely is the face of that, but that doesn't mean he's actually the actual hammer that was causing these things to occur.
Yeah, I think you actually highlight a really key point there. His arrogance, I think, is part of the reason he's arrogant in almost a way that doesn't help him. Where I think J. Edgar Hoover was most certainly a narcissist of some kind, or arrogant at the very least. But he did so. He was that way, but was effectively secretive about it. And his way of puffing up himself was through the control he wielded behind the scenes, very specifically. I think Fauci, his arrogance has put him in a place where he may have been responsible directly for the institutions that created COVID, under what reasons, but his arrogance made him so combative in the hearings that they became widely publicized. Now, a lot of people saw it and they cheered for Fauci at the time because they're drones and just repeating what MSNBC is going to say. But in particular, when Senator Rand Paul was grilling him, now we have all the records of Fauci directly contradicting, directly lying, with all of the different leaked emails and behind the scenes freedom of information requests that have been made. We have the raw data that shows these claims to be demonstrably false. And what's more, in these hearings, specifically because I think of Fauci's bravado, because of his arrogance, I think there's a couple things. One, he drew attention to them, which made people more investigative in the first place. Two, I think it made this sort of rivalry between, cynically, for fundraising reasons, right? Rand Paul's office could be like, oh, if we get more combative with him, we can use this to fundraise to the base. The more optimistic view being, he seems really defiant. We have to make sure to prove what he's saying wrong. But because he flared this up, rather than making it a very low-key hearing, a very just, down to the facts, deny things and just say, we'll get back to you on that, he had to go out and say, what you're completely misunderstanding and all that kind of thing. And ironically, I think that because of the combative nature, because he had needed his pride stroked, he drew attention to people who made some freedom of information requests. In particular, I think of the fact that he got combative with the royalties being made that Rand Paul asked him about. And he's like, they under law, they don't need to disclose. He could have said, my office will get back to you on that, and then done nothing. And that would not, but because he did that, specifically because he did that, I know of people who went out of their way because of that, filed Freedom of Information Request acts. They got denied. They took it to the Supreme Court and they got it released. And that showed that the money is in fact going to these people. So all that to say, Fauci, because of his arrogance, as you pointed out, I think is a great point, does almost every danger he had in potentially helping create COVID and helping lock down is undermined because he can now be toppled by his own undoing, which was not something that we're still finding stuff out about the nefarious things of J. Edgar Hoover, for instance.
Yeah, and he ruled the FBI for 50 years almost.
Exactly.
So that's a long time to fly under the radar without any major public backlash. So that guy, J. Edgar Hoover, obviously much more dangerous than Dr. Fauci.
Agreed. Okay, we'll move on to the next take here. This one comes from Being Libertarian, the Twitter account. They write, Dear government, after a nearly 40-year-long war on drugs, you can't keep drugs off the streets. You can't keep drugs out of elementary schools. You can't even keep drugs out of federal prison. Yet you want me to disarm myself and trust that you can keep guns from criminals. What do you think about this take?
This is a great take. I'm not sure if I've shared this story before, but I went out shooting with one of my buddies out in the mountains out here in Washington, and it got dark pretty fast. And we actually found ourselves like out there after it had gone pitch black, sun had gone down, and I heard like an animal just kind of moaning or groaning or making some noise, growling. Didn't know if it was a bear or something else. Sounded like a bear to me. So we were kind of scared about that, and we were hiking out of there. And I kept my rifle on as we hiked out. I was like, well, you know what? If I'm going to be out of cell range in the middle of the mountains with a bear potentially, around me or some mountain lion stalking me, I've got about a 50-50 chance, with this rifle, as opposed to a 0% chance if it came at me if I don't have this rifle. And I was thinking about that. I was like, man, like this feeling of like I have my life in my own hands in case something happens. That is the feeling that the bureaucrats want to take away from you when they want to disarm you. How much more dangerous is it to be walking around in downtown Seattle or downtown? I mean, we saw this in, I think it was in Chicago, maybe it's Chicago. I can't remember. There was that video of a poor guy sitting on the side of the sidewalk, and they clearly see this guy loading a gun. He takes like maybe 30 seconds. He's got it all jammed. He's loading it. They're filming him. And after he gets it unjammed, he just points it at the guy and he shoots him. So how much more of a chance is there that you're going to be hurt in one of these urban areas where there's a lot of crime and a lot of violence and a lot of people who are not either right in the head or intend to do you violence, to take your belongings, or just want to hurt you? And they want to disarm you in that. It's like, man, that's a criminal thing to want to take the ability for someone to defend themselves away from them. And additionally, not only that, like, even though you could promise with the best of intentions, let's say there was no intention to like make you disarm because they want you to be harmed. Even if they wanted to protect you, this post by Being Libertarian makes a great point in that they can't, right? Something as simple as making sure that a certain type of chemical or drug is not on the street, they can't even keep that off. How much more do you think they're going to be able to take guns off the street? They're not going to be able to.
Yeah, I think the killer line here is you can't even keep drugs out of federal prison.
Yeah.
That's the most eye-opening of all of these, in my opinion, because prison is kind of the comparison point that people will make to authoritarian regimes, right? Oh, you want to give up freedom? Well, have fun living in a prison. That's kind of the reference point you make. Like, how much freedom are you willing to sacrifice for safety? Because you should just check yourself into prison. And even in the one zone where the government has basically totalitarian control, they cannot prevent the drugs from getting on there. So it's it's pretty crazy to think about it in that way. As far as the gun thing goes, yeah, I think that people they don't think about the fact that there are so many ways for people to be violent in society, even
Yeah.
if you were to perfectly ban guns in this magical way and only give them to racist police officers. uh, the level of violence that humans are capable of means that the gun is the great equalizer. The
Yes.
the quote we always reference, but you know you just don't have the same kind of control that you do from random acts of violence without one. And the thing is, people can always say, well, isn't a gun just an escalation? Like everyone's level gets brought up. But what I would argue is that the handgun as a form of self-defense is so much more of an equalizer, because people who want to stay safe, people who want to protect something, themselves, their property, their families, they have a much lower barrier to entry into practicing for a gun, how to use it, training on being proficient with it. And just that escalation of potential violence is enough of a deterrent in many cases to stave off anything to begin with, let alone the fact that the people who are going to want to inflict violence and the people who are want to cause harm or destruction, they're not thinking holistically in the same way. So a lot of those people are they're not going to have a gun because their aim isn't to be like, I'm going to be a professional criminal. maybe they're just acting out in a flurry of rage, and so they didn't bring a gun with them, or maybe they're acting out and they just want to steal something, or they just want to destroy something. You know, being prepared with a gun is a huge advantage in a society where guns are available. It's not an equal distribution of, if we let everyone have guns, then all you get is more violence across the board. No, like, people who are well prepared and well trained and want and have a reason to defend will equip the weapons, will equip the guns, and be ready to de-escalate. Whereas people who are intending to cause harm and violence are not usually going to have that same level. That's just the vast majority of violent crime is not committed with a gun in that same way. And so, people always bring up mass shootings, and those are tragic and awful. But you also have to recognize that there would be so many more incidents of violence, so many more killings without guns being available to people to defend, to de-escalate, to prevent those kinds of crimes as well.
Yeah, and to the people saying, if everyone is armed, then the violence escalates. It's like, well, think about this. Like, if I put you in a hallway, there's no doors out. It's just a hallway. There's 20 feet between you and Mike Tyson, and he wants to kill you. You have about a 0% chance of winning if you don't have a gun. If you both have a gun, you kind of have about a 50-50 chance, right? Like, it's suddenly been equaled out. And so, when people say, like, well, we don't want people to have, what you're saying is to that, that 115-pound woman that wants to protect herself, that she doesn't have the right to do that. She doesn't have a right to be on equal footing with someone that bears her ill intent. You're telling people that are older and weaker and don't have as much of their faculties available to them that they don't deserve to be well armed. They don't deserve to be able to protect themselves or to take their lives in the hands, and they have to rely on, as we've already established, a federal government that can't even keep violence out of prisons or keep drugs out of prisons. So, it raises the floor of what potential violence there could be. But it's not just for the bad guys. It's also for the good guys. They become more capable. They become more able to protect themselves, which overall is a good thing.
Yeah, not to mention that I genuinely believe the de-escalation levels are greater, because if there's two people with guns, I would argue that there's a greater likelihood that that's going to de-escalate than two people with, like, say, a baseball bat and, like, their fists. In that sense, people almost get like a fight or flight response, and they're going to go into fight mode. Whereas when you see a gun, it makes you think twice.
Yeah.
So anyway, we'll move to our next take here. This one comes from Spike Cohen, former guest on Cringe Posts. So the GOP Twitter account tweeted, "Government should be so small you don't even realize it's there." And then Spike quote retweets this, saying, "Then why do you grow it just as fast as the Dems do when you're in charge of it?" And what do you say to that, Brett?
I mean, we've had Spike on the show before. Really nice guy, and this is a fantastic take. I mean, the what's the other one? I don't think it's his quote, but Republicans are just Democrats driving the speed limit.
Yeah,
or
the
progressives. Michael Malice. Okay, yeah. So, the Republicans will talk a good game, and they'll say all the things that they need to say to get into office, and then once they're in there, they do the exact opposite. People talk about the inflation that's going on right now. A lot of Republicans in the GOP will say, "Hey, like, Biden's inflation, Bideflation, all this stuff." But it's really, I mean, Trump is the one that wrote all the bills and signed all the bills into place that have caused the inflation that we have right now. He oversaw the greatest spending bills that the United States has ever seen. And if you want to say that's not representative of big government, I mean, I don't really know what is then at that point. So it's massive spending, massive, increase in the military. You think about George W. Bush in the 2000s with the Patriot Act, like the greatest expansions of government in terms of invasion of our personal liberty and privacy. I mean, they're equally shared among Democrats and Republicans, but the Republicans have very notable examples of it that you can point to.
Yeah, I think there may be more examples of people being able to say, but what about X person doing Y, and having an R attached to that name, right? So you might have someone say, well, what about all of the regulations that Donald Trump rolled back when he was in the executive office? Or you might say, well, what about Thomas Massey requiring everyone to come in and voice vote on this and voting in opposition? And what I would grant you is that probably on the whole, the party that pretends to want small government is going to produce some people who are true believers and do that thing. Yes, on the whole, there are probably more pro-liberty Republicans than Democrats. However, when you look at the percentage, it doesn't really matter that much because one, I mean, for the Trump example, great, he rolled back all the regulations on an executive level so they could just be re-implemented by the next person in no meaningful change way. Uh, Two, he obviously signed big spending bills that happened, and it's like, but like even with Thomas Massey, yeah, sure, he was great, but all of his colleagues voted for it anyway. So yeah, you can say, well, here's a handful of examples of Republicans that have done this well, but when the overwhelming majority of them aren't actually shrinking government, you have to realize that it's not about Republicans being able to shrink the government because of Thomas Massey. It's about, oh, there are individual people who do some individual good things and they might be Republicans. It has nothing to do with them being Republican.
And they're usually scorned by the Republican establishment. Those individuals.
Exactly. Totally right. So it's kind of at what point, what percentage do you have to get before you realize that, okay, yeah, in theory, here's one thing I gotta say. A lot of the criticisms against libertarian or anarchist thought is how, oh, it's a really great theory. I was just watching a video of Michael Knowles and Ben Shapiro playing the yes or no game, and they talk about libertarianism briefly, and they're like, well, yeah, everyone, they're idealistic when they're young, and it's a great theory, but it just doesn't work if you know people and if you work in the real world. And I just wanted to like yell at my screen, like what world are you living in where you see the government shrinking because of Republicans, because of this? Like, no, the only reason libertarianism is great is because it works in the real world, because of that, and because your ideology hasn't. So to that point, at what point of the percentage of the GOP do you have to say, like, okay, in theory, a 97% bad party is better than a 99% bad party? But at what point do you have to come in the real world and say, no, we actually need significant change. We can't just live in a matter of like driving off this cliff at 59 miles an hour instead of 61, to your earlier example.
Yeah, that's it's just a difference in the rate, or not even the rate, but the rhetoric that they use to get elected. That's really the only difference. And like I said earlier, the Republicans that actually do propose things that would shrink the government. I mean, there's a couple of Republicans that always propose balancing the budget, and it never gets any widespread support from the GOP, even though they talk about that all the time and they talk about being fiscally responsible and all this stuff, but it never gets any support from them. And then the senators and the Congress people that actually do support those things and are vocal about it, they kind of are relegated to the outside of all this stuff, because the same incentives that the Democrats have being in government, personal incentives, also exist for the GOP. They'd like you to think that they don't, but they are both motivated by the same types of stuff. And therefore, that's why the most awful things are usually bipartisan, because humans respond to incentives. And when you're in the government, there is no incentive to create anything, only to take and destroy and absorb as much as you can before you're booted out of office. And so that's exactly what they do.
Yeah. And I will say the one asterisk is I think the more local you get, the more accountable people tend to be. And the more
Sure.
you might have an argument for this kind of thing. I think generally it's more about having split party control, or at least minority party control, based on historic factors and things like that, whether or not you're going to get big or small government. A party that has, in a red state, red legislatures often, not always, but often grow government, and in blue states, blue governments do. So it definitely depends. But I would just say, generally speaking, the lower you get, the less applicable this kind of thinking that I've been arguing for is. Sure. I think, because there's less room for corruption between. Now, I think there's always some level, and you definitely need to weigh people on their merits. But I think about, when you have like a local county election, or an election to a school board or something, and that may not be partisan, but you have some people saying, hey, we should teach radical gender theory to all third graders, and then you have someone saying, no, let's teach them to ninth graders. I think at that level, it's like, yeah, you're still marching in a bad direction, but I'm definitely going to actually throw support, because that's a crucial 6-year difference. I think that's a pretty substantive difference. Whereas I would argue, on the whole, at least the more federal you get, it really is closer to like 97 to 99%. Yep. And you have to recognize that something's got to change. Okay, let's move to our next take. This one comes from Existential Comics on Twitter. I know we featured them on Cringe Posts a
Yep.
couple of times here. So I wonder which way this one's gonna go. They tweet, under communism, you wouldn't have a boss who you have to obey or starve. You'd think this. You'd think of this. You'd sort of, there we go. I was like, why am I reading this wrong? You'd sort of think this alone would be enough to convince absolutely everyone to become a communist in like 12 seconds, but apparently not. And a follow up tweet, like, why did they have to keep making more propaganda after, hey, you know that guy who bosses you around that everyone hates, but you have to listen to him anyway because he has a piece of paper that says he owns everything? Yeah, we're getting rid of that system. What do you think, Britt? Do you,
It's a terrible take, and I would think it's a joke if it didn't come from Existential Comics, who's
right.
just got some of the worst takes I've seen on Twitter. Like you said, we featured them on Cringe Posts before, in the past. But the ultimate boss that you have to work for is reality, which is
Yeah.
if you don't make food, there is no food for you to eat, and therefore you will starve. And so, that's one aspect of it. And then two, I mean, this is just like so representative of that, like that. I mean, that very Republican, like fictional character of like, oh, well, like under communism, in the commune, I would be the artist, like kind of person. It's like, what do you think that there are no bosses in communism? There are no people who are in charge and have it better than other people in it. I mean, and they like to hold up, the Soviet Union stuff. It's like, okay, so what was Stalin then? In the Soviet Union, and what was Mao? In China, it's like, yeah, they were the boss, and if you didn't do what they said, you died. There's a funny meme that's like, under capitalism, it's work or starve, and under communism, it's work and starve. And so that's just kind of how it works under them. And I don't like his last. I especially don't like his last point. It's like, hey, that guy who bosses you around that everyone hates, but you have to listen to him anyway because he has a piece of paper that says he owns everything. It's like, no, in a capitalist system, I mean, in some ways that can occur. Usually it only occurs in industries that are either highly, they have like some nepotism in them from like family members are giving it to their kids. In which case, that business, if the kid doesn't become qualified, to run the business, it will go under and they won't have anything to run anymore. Or it comes through, bureaucratic appointments, or different types of companies, like getting like Hunter Biden, right? Burisma in Ukraine, putting Hunter Biden on their board to manage things, and they get it through some form of corruption or through some sort of a quid pro quo between the private sector and the public sector. So in general, the people in capitalism, it's the position you have is the position that you have earned in some way. And the only way for you to keep it is for you to continue to perform. If you don't perform, then you won't have it anymore. And if part of your good performance is making sure that people like you and your employees like you, then you will keep it. There are some jobs where it is not essential for your employees to like you. There's not many of them, but and you won't get very far, but some bosses function that way, and then employees usually will quit and go work someplace else where there is a boss that does treat them well. So, we do have a system that accounts for that. And the best way for you to get out of that, if you work for a boss that you don't like, is to improve your skills, and so that you're more marketable and you can find a job someplace else where they value you more.
Yeah, I was gonna say, let's even assume, for the sake of this terrible take, that all of this is true. And then they're like, you think that would be enough for everyone to not become a communist in 12 seconds, but apparently not. Yeah. The blood trail, I think, was a little bit smelly for me. I didn't want to, have to smell the reek of corpses surrounding me and starvation. Yeah, the terrible legacy of communism, I think, is maybe a little bit of a backdrop you need to paint.
Yeah.
This is such a stupid take. I think you demonstrated why the content of it, which is already weak and makes a lot of assumptions, completely wrong. But to ignore the historic realities of what communism has brought is clearly unhinged to overlook these things. Even the closest examples these people will bring up to more socialized states are nowhere near communism. Even when you look at Scandinavian countries, which in many respects are terrible comparison points for US
Yeah.
policy, they will vehemently claim they are capitalist economies that operate under the assumption of people being able to own things and people being able to own, work and profit on their own. And they're just, uh, democratically socialist, I believe it was the term they like to use, or yeah, they don't like that. They're not socialists. They call themselves capitalists, but I think the terminology we would use would be democratic socialist, which is just sort of heavy taxation on things like individual taxes or whatever. But even these countries are fundamentally opposed to the actual ideology of communism. I think that there's a disconnect a lot of the times, especially when you're a liberty-minded person. I know we actually had a take about this, I think, from Rubio saying when he was supposed to attend something or other and they needed a COVID test, and he's like, "This is what you get when you get communism in the school or teach socialism," and it's like people have a very disconnected idea of what these terms mean in reality. And yes, on the sliding scale, like of liberty to total control, socialism does bleed into communism, absolutely. But the difference between democratic socialism, that is heavy taxation, heavy government involvement, to even socialism and even furthermore communism, there's a big jump there. There's a big switch that has to be flipped, that I think that most of the what I would say rational people who support leftist policies, which is a little counterintuitive to some degree, but I'm trying to delineate between like the terminally online Tumblr kin people and actual humans who function in the real world who are just very wrong about their political opinions. I think that the jump between those people, like what they think communism might be, or socialism at least, and what it actually is an implementation and what it would actually mean for them on the real level, is a they wouldn't actually support these things if they recognized, guess what, you don't get to own your property, and that means that you don't get to choose where you live, and that means that you don't get to control how your family is run, all these different things. I think that there's a big difference there. And so yeah, even if all of the sort of straw man arguments about capitalism here were true, I would gladly take being yelled at by someone I don't like in order to live my free time with my family in the way I see fit, rather than not having any control of anything, potentially getting shot and killed, all from a soldier coming into my home and yelling at me to do what he wants. Or else my family gets starved in front of me.
Yeah, the you're not gonna watch Ant-Man, are you? The new one?
No, I'm
Okay,
not.
so there's this freaking awful moment where
Oh well, spoiler alert for those of you.
spoiler alert, spoiler alerts to everyone, but basically all hope seems lost, and Hank Pym has these ants that have suddenly become technologically advanced, and they come in to save the day. It's pretty ridiculous. But anyways, they come in, save the day, and he's like, I know socialism charged ward, but implying that it works. It's like, okay, dude, like, one, I'm not sure if you could really, like, to your point, equate a bunch of mindless workers doing what they are being forced to do tasks, even if it means self-sacrificing themselves, to socialism. That is communism. And then two, like, do you really want that? Like,
Yeah, I was gonna say,
do you want like society to be like, we all just become mindless workers? Like, that doesn't sound awesome. So it's just really frustrating. Like, how, I mean, and that's what contributes to this, right? Existential comics, the culture, the people who write the culture are not aware of these things and they buy into it, or they purposely are deceitful, one way or the other. And that's how people kind of get these misnomers and misunderstandings about what socialism, communism actually are, and what their outcomes and conclusions are.
Well, I was going to say that sounds an awful lot like the design of the Prussian public school system that we run under. So
Yeah.
maybe that is desirable for some people.
Yeah.
I don't think the world's better off having a few people sitting on top comfortably while the rest of us are mindless drones. Okay, and last take here, and this one's going to be fun. We've got a Pope Francis quote tweeted by Jordan Peterson. So Pope Francis tweets, #social justice demands that we fight against the causes of poverty, inequality, and the lack of labor, land, and lodging. against those who deny social and labor rights, and against the culture that leads to taking away the dignity of others. And Dr. Jordan Peterson tweets, there is nothing Christian about hashtag social justice. Redemptive salvation is a matter of the individual soul. What do you think about this take?
Yeah, so oh man, it's a hard one. Like my initial impression of it was that it's a good take. Like just kind of intuitively thinking about it. I also have a little bit of a bias because I really like Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. And after thinking about it more, and as we've been doing the episode, I still think it's a good one. And here's why. It's because I'm going to try to explain why. um, I think that the modern day interpretation of social justice is, and especially the one that Pope Francis is talking about in his tweet, it very much looks outward and it says, there's a problem, there is an oppressor and there is an oppressed. I am not a part of the oppressor class. I am one of the oppressed, or at least I am going to ally myself with the oppressed. And every single bit of justice that occurs must occur outside of myself. And that leads to, in my opinion, hate and greed and ugliness towards other people, right? You're perpetuating the same type of dehumanization and evil and ugliness that you're claiming to be against. And so I like that Jordan is saying, redemptive salvation is actually a matter of the individual soul. It's looking within myself and saying, where have I actually contributed to this? How do I change myself? And then in lieu of that, how do I move out into the world to also rectify that, right? And realizing that the line of good and evil cuts between, it's not arbitrary and there's good people and bad people. It actually cuts between the heart of every single person that's out there. And that the people who are oppressors are also I very well could have been the same person, right, in that position. And so I'm a little bit reading into it. And I think that's what he's saying. And that's why I like his take. I don't necessarily like how a lot of Christians who don't care about social justice, right? Because we are, as Christians, called to make sure that the oppressed are lifted up, that we restore dignity to others, that we fight back against causes of poverty, inequity, and and lack of labor and land, and all those things. Like, people will use this kind of as an excuse to not do things about that. I just think that Pope Francis's thing is like a call to who implements that. And it's like, oh, it should be the government, and it should be us saying that, hey, this group of people is bad and that they should now live in poverty and things like that. It seems very vengeful and not actually Christian. Whereas, Jesus very much preached turn the other cheek, right? The only way that you win in this type of struggle is to convert your enemy and to love your enemy, not to totally destroy them. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I kind of struggle. I feel like I have to pull Dr. Jordan Peterson here and say, well, it depends on what you mean by the term social justice.
Yeah.
Because if he's talking about the modern iteration of social justice and the way that what's the word? The way it's used and its connotations in the current culture, I agree. I think when we talk about like a social justice warrior or social justice in the political context, if you're talking about capital social, capital justice, which again, this hashtag is, I completely agree with Jordan Peterson. If we're talking about the more nebulous phrase social justice, I vehemently disagree.
Yeah.
And this is coming from someone who is a very individualistic in many ways politically, but one of the great tragedies, I think, of the modern Protestant Western church is that we've turned everything into your Christianity is just between you and Jesus, and that's it. And I think that neglects the broader scope of the Christian faith, which has a lot of collective guilt. I think even, obviously there's a difference between New Testament and Old Testament law and New Testament and Old Testament theology in some respects. But I think it's really interesting that even when you look at some of the Old Testament law, you read through some of the ceremonial things they have, sacrifices they have to do. And it's like, it lists out, if someone does the sin, whether knowingly or unknowingly, once they realize they've sinned, they have to make this kind of a sacrifice. If this person does that, if that person does that, and it gives all these lists. And one of them is if the people have done this collectively, and everyone is responsible in that sense to some degree. we also have to recognize, as most people would say, that we all inherit the sin of Adam. So there is some collective responsibility for things that we have not individually done. However, that being said, I think that it is wrong in the way that social justice is enacted, the way that social justice is tries to be rectified in the modern culture, because like you pointed out, it's always shown that there are like victims of this, and that there must be restitution paid on a human level. Whereas to me, the collective sin, the collective guilt that we have is sin against God and God alone. Sin is not sin is not even like, if I hit you, I haven't sinned against you. I've sinned against God. I've done you wrong, but I haven't sinned against you. And so I think that social justice in so many ways is about trying to give control and power to a group of individuals, as though they have no collective sin, no collective wrong, and I'm responsible for these things that I haven't done. But I owe reparations to people who I don't actually owe them to. So it's a complicated issue. I think that there is something Christian about the idea of some social justice, and like you said, we're called to these things, but not in the modern iteration at all.
Yeah, as you're talking, I thought of two things. One is that most of the people that call for this type of social justice, right, they're saying things like this, that like, hey, we need to have this or that type of policy, we need to pay reparations and things like that. They are actually some of the greatest. Them and the policies they advocate for are some of the greatest perpetuators of poverty, inequality,
Yeah.
lack of labor, land, and lodging, and human dignity. Like, I think about the way some politicians on the left who are very SJW like talk about black people, about how, in a very like, oh, well, we need to take care of them, or we need to, they might not be able to get a license, or, how are they going to be able to pull themselves up? It's like, that's a very dehumanizing way to talk about a group of people. Like, I'd rather look at them from an individual lens. And it reminds me of the Bible verse, Proverbs 12:10, which says that even the compassion of the wicked is cruel.
Yeah.
And I had this discussion with one of my friends earlier this week. And, he was talking about, he's very much in the online community with a lot of non-Christian friends with him and stuff. And he's like, all my friends are like, well, why are Christians just so hateful? Why do they not have more love? I thought Jesus preached love. And he was trying to kind of harp on the church in that way. And I was like, you know what? In some ways, you're right? Like the modern day church in the United States has done a poor job in some aspects of that. We also give the most to charity by a way and afar. But that point aside, why would I listen to someone lament about how the church is unloving when that same person supports, the killing of babies, right? It's like this. Why should the church listen to people or take stock in someone criticizing us for being unloving when they themselves, their definition of love doesn't even match up with what we are talking about? And like I was saying in Proverbs 12:10, even the compassion of the wicked is cruel. If someone is worldly, if someone doesn't have, the same moral perspective that, we shouldn't kill babies, and that, people are better off, improving themselves than being handed things. Like, I want to actually work for the longevity of someone, not because I want to feel good in the moment. If someone doesn't hold those views, of course, my view of love to them is going to sound hateful, right? Of course, their version of love is going to be like, well, you're totally opposite of me. And so that's why I like Jordan Peterson's take, because I think like you're saying, it's capital S, capital J, social justice. I think it's the modern day interpretation of it, which to me is actually, it masks itself as compassion, but it's really just cruelty.
Yeah, I agree. I think that when we look at the the effects, if in a vacuum, saying things like, let's fight against causes of poverty. Okay, great. But how we do that is radically different from what most of the social justice peddlers will tell you. They will tell you it is all the fault of people who are well off, and if we just, like even if we look at this amorally and just look at it from a practical lens, all we
Yeah.
have to do is tax them and distribute their money down. That's just a system that just doesn't end up working, because you will have people who leave. You'll have people who stop creating industry. You then, instead of fixing the cause of inequality, you've added to the cause of poverty.
Yeah.
Um, I The other thing is that when you talk about collective guilt and collective repentance, that comes from an authority that people have to own up to. And I don't think that the US government is a good, well, and Pope Francis obviously isn't in the US, and neither is Peterson, but the state governments, I should say, of the nation states of the world have just proven themselves to be more corrupt, more awful and evil, and I just don't think they have the integrity of authority to be those people who are enacting these, righting these wrongs. You know, you think about, for instance, the plans in, I think it's South Africa, to seize farmland from the white farmers and just violently take it over and give it to the black farmers, and because you know, to as justice, quote unquote, for apartheid. And it's like, look, justice, true justice doesn't involve the violent taking of one person to another. Justice means that people are brought equal. And I think that, like, and, you know, the Christian sense of justice, I think, involves a level of acknowledgement, and you know, if someone has something and they can generously give it to someone else to right a wrong, that is a better form of justice than someone taking it from them and causing more conflict, more violence, more angst in the present than there would otherwise be. So I think that it just becomes a game of, this person gets oppressed, and then in retaliation some force comes in and takes from the other side of the equation, and then now that person just got oppressed. And so there's a balance to these things, and I don't think the modern social justice movement knows how to balance those things well, and there's not a good mediator to enforce that. And that's why I think I think that's where Jordan Peterson's point about redemptive salvation as a matter of the individual soul is pertinent, in that in order to achieve actual justice, actual redemption, you need the individual to voluntarily do these things, to come to terms. The wealthy person to voluntarily donate and give and help out, and be charitable to those who in the past have been wronged.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Okay, unless you got anything more, I think we're good. Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, guys, for tuning into this episode. If you want to give us a follow and a like and a comment, we love to hear it. Send us any takes that you think are worthy of talking about, and we will catch you on the next one.